Let's talk about innovation as a criterion that any undergraduate writer working on an essay about literature should keep in mind. This lecture is a somewhat extended version of what is already included in my one-page handout on innovation, also copied at my webpage on innovation where this video is embedded and where you may be watching this. Feel free to follow along with those as I talk. So, if you've received feedback from professors saying things like obvious, shallow, unoriginal, not risky, no support, or anything to do with sources or research, then this is a criterion that likely requires your attention. Oops. The primary goal of a university humanities essay is to show the instructor something about a class text that they had not seen before, in a way that changes, however slightly, the way they will see it and teach it in the future. Again, let me say that again. The primary goal of a university humanities essay is to show the instructor, me, something about a class text that I had not seen before, even though I may have spent my entire career looking at texts like this, in a way that changes, however slightly, the way I will see it and teach it in the future. That's your goal. Now, you can't probe your instructor's brain to find out what we see already. Please don't. But here's what you can do. Consult scholarly publications. It's one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give the undergraduate essay writer. Become familiar with the ongoing scholarly discussion on your subject and position your thesis in clear relation to that discussion. Remember in other talks what I have defined a thesis as. Position your thesis in clear relation to the discussion you have discovered across scholarly publications. Unless the prompt or the prof bars you from doing so, you should consult and cite however many scholarly publications are necessary for you to make your argument convincing and innovative, and to position your innovation with respect to an already ongoing discourse. If you wind up with fewer sources than are required, if you do have a required number of sources, that probably means you aren't innovating enough. That doesn't mean you shouldn't pad your list of sources with extra. It means you need to come up with a more innovative hypothesis that demands you look at more sources. If you come up against a prompt that a professor gives you that limits or bars you from looking at sources, that's fine. That means we're doing a thought experiment to see what you would do in that situation. But if you feel confined by it, you can always ask the prof to see whether there's any wiggle room or leeway. And then whichever answer that's given, either treat it as an exercise or use that leeway. What else can you do to innovate? Cite thoughtfully. Frame your contributions. Make sure your citations, right? It's not just about avoiding plagiarism, the P word. Make sure your citations make clear where prior work ends and your innovation begins so that we can know what you have invented. Right? These clear citations are necessary for your reader to understand what you are adding to the scholarly discussion. Use signal phrases. That's a great example, right? Very often we'll use things like, according to Percy, X, but, right? Rather than, as Hernandez puts it, Y, I will say, right? While Sergi argues X, I will argue Y. To make sure that the distinction is clear and unambiguous between what the sources you're citing have said and what you are saying. Signal phrases are not the only way to do it, but they are especially valuable and underused in undergraduate papers. Now remember, each new sentence requires a new citation. If a sentence is a thought coming from Latin sententia, sententiae, thought or feeling, one thought, one sentence, each sentence requires a new citation. If you find yourself citing the same text over and over again, that means you need to be more innovative and more rigorous and probably more clear in what you're saying, right? If you find you're just repeating something, you're just really just citing the same text and you're not responding to those texts at all. So you should be interrupting your citation with your interpretation because that's what you're here to do. All right. Consult widely. It's not just a matter of adding a bunch of text for the sake of text. Don't ever do that. The number of works you consult should exceed the number of works you interact with directly in your paper. Consider using footnotes, endnotes, or a works consulted list to give proper credit when that happens. It may be also appropriate to provide a short in-text reference to comparable work done elsewhere. Let's say if your point was at all inspired by a similar argument elsewhere, be sure to provide a brief citation of some kind to show that you're aware of that similar argument and that you are jumping off of it in a certain way. You should never ever cherry pick sources to falsely signal innovation. You should be exhausting your available resources as far as the assignment allows to find precedents for what you're saying, and you should be adjusting your hypothesis to make sure that you are innovating beyond those sources. If you are breaking truly new ground, that is, no one in this field has ever talked about what I am talking about here, then I would recommend referring briefly to a range of sources consulted. Something like, I have not yet found any scholarly work that mentions the subject, though I have consulted this text, this text, this text, this text. Don't make the mistake of saying, critics have said, critics have not yet said, and then only cite one critic. That's not ample evidence. And then you would use a footnote in that case that lists the multiple sources you consulted to demonstrate that there is no precedent, right? So if it becomes too long a list, you might want to put it in a footnote. All right. However, keep it small, close, and slow. You should be researching as far as your subject goes, which means you should be talking about something, and this relates to specificity, talking about something small, close, and slow. Avoid massive thematic or historical projects for your 5 to 10 page paper. Those are subjects more appropriate for an academic book. Class discussion in your class will already cover many of the large-scale concerns related to course texts, and your instructor has already thought about most of the others in a deeper way than you'll be able to access in a short essay in little time. I'll pause on that for a second. Often the thing that misleads students about what an essay is supposed to do is because they think that an essay is supposed to be the same thing as what is covered in, say, a lecture, which by nature is an overview of breadth, or a class discussion, which by nature dances around and through and plays through a variety of possibilities. The essay is where you show us a different way of thinking, where you can think in a focused way about one thing, right? So if you're choosing something as massive, thematic, or historical as, say, the subject of one of your professor's lectures, you've chosen something too big. If you are actually interested in making an innovative contribution using the tools you have, right? And that's the tools you have, right? Like, you're not only trying to impress your professor. You shouldn't only be trying to impress your professor. You're trying to make a contribution to change the professor's mind. If you're actually interested in that, you should be using close reading to analyze a very specific and very small element of a course text. It is very unlikely that we'll already have thought much about that small piece you've chosen. Unless you are otherwise instructed, do not use an argumentative essay to demonstrate your knowledge and comprehension of core course concepts, nor to blanketly reapply core course concepts to the material. If we wanted you to do that, we would give you a quiz or an essay test or something like that, other ways to assess your knowledge, comprehension, and application of course concepts. But if you regurgitate class material, you're definitely telling me what I already know. And the whole point of an essay is to try to tell me something I don't already know. Again, if your professor tells you something otherwise, if your professor makes clear that the essay is to try to test your application of and basic understanding of core course concepts, do that. But if you are not instructed to do that, don't. Otherwise, you will not be sufficiently innovative. And finally, the big one. This is the one that I think has proven most useful to my students. You should avoid redundancy. We've already said that you should be looking at the scholarly field and thinking through what has already been said and striving to say what has not yet been said. That is the definition of innovation. So if you're about to cite a published work for pure affirmation, this point that I've made has actually already been made by Hernandez, because it makes the same exact point you're arguing. Stop and think, why are you arguing something that Hernandez or whomever has already argued in a prior work? You can use this prior scholarship as a jumping off point for your own argumentation, but you can't use your own argumentation simply to arrive at the same point that a prior scholar has already made. Otherwise, you're not arguing at all. I found it's a helpful rule of thumb to take one of the following approaches to every secondary source you cite. I mean, when you cite a secondary source in your essays, almost every time, you should be doing and make clear how you are doing one of these three things. You should disagree with the source you're citing. That's fine. Taking a respectful tone, identify a flaw in a prior scholar's argument, and then discuss in your essay the effects of that flaw on subsequent conclusions or readings. Such a flaw may be a plain misreading, it might be a misunderstanding, it might be reductive logic, it might be an omission of relevant evidence, you might bring up an ambiguity that a prior scholar has seen as not ambiguous and bring something out through that. You can also deepen, right? You're not going to constantly disagree with other scholars, though very often a good essay begins with a light disagreement. But you can also deepen, right? You're taking a prior scholar's argument even further than they did, perhaps by revealing new evidence that shows that the argument has ramifications that the scholar did not consider. This is important, and this is probably the type of citation you'll use most. It is not enough to simply take a scholar's established approach and reapply it to a new text. Your reapplication must require some reshaping of the scholar's work, deepening of the scholar's work, illuminating in it a new layer of meaning. And finally, this is my favorite, and it gets great results, though it's not always possible, destabilize. Treat the scholar's work as a text in itself. Identify inherent contradictions or read it against the grain, perhaps in a way that reveals an underlying assumption or bias that has colored prior readings of the text being analyzed. So recalibrate the lens and look again at both primary and secondary texts. Right? The idea is you're using the microscope to look at the specimen, but actually you use it as a way of recalibrating the microscope as well as understanding the specimen. And those are 3 ways you can avoid redundancy and thus be innovative. I use the 3 Ds because I think it's really useful, a mnemonic to every time you cite a secondary text. Ask yourself, which of these Ds am I doing? If you're not, there may be a concern that you're not adequately innovating. It's not a rule that applies 100%, but it applies way more often than you would think. So, disagree, deepen, and destabilize. We'll talk more about that in future lectures. Thanks.